Welcome to the first segment of our three-part series on ADHD myths. Fun fact, did you know ADHD and related symptoms have been discussed as an issue in society for a surprisingly long time, dating as far back as 500 BC? Since then, it's been mentioned throughout and applied to various types of documents, including some of Shakespeare's works and the Bible. It's only been discussed scientifically since the late 18th century, though. It was actually introduced into the DSM-2 in the 1960s as hyperkinetic reaction of childhood, but over time it became known as attention deficit disorder, and later, as we know it today, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Now, with its own subcategories, including being with or without hyperactivity, or presenting as having both hyperactivity and no hyperactivity, presumably at different times.
As stated by Daly and Birchwood, one cannot expect a child to operate successfully in an academic environment if they are inattentive, disruptive, and aggressive, and have problems with working memory, planning, and organization regarding children with ADHD. These symptoms are often regarded as the core tenets of ADHD, and while they can vary in severity, they manifest in different forms in different people.
Many of these discussions were focused around children who were considered extraordinarily active, loud, or disobedient. Historically, children were expected to remain calm and obedient, following the saying of children are to be seen and not heard. The children who didn't comply with these expectations were discussed as having some sort of medical issue. They were viewed as being abnormal to the point of causing a disruption, or more generally being incompetent and therefore unable to complete their responsibilities or being adequate participants in society.
Furthermore, neuroimaging studies of children with ADHD have shown a decreased size of the prefrontal cortex. Therefore, there are expected deficits in certain prefrontal executive functions, such as response inhibition and working memory. These key neural traits may correlate with poor academic performance and poorer grades overall. The classic image of the child with ADHD being rash, impulsive, and loud may rarely be accurate, but the fact stands that the symptoms of ADHD can heavily interfere with school, relationships, and life, and have a basis in little executive function control. And furthermore, as Daly and Birchwood go on to say, ADHD has typically fallen into one of two camps: that ADHD is a disorder of dysregulation of thought and action associated with poor inhibitory control, and that ADHD is the manifestation of a motivational style associated with altered reward mechanisms. And while both are true and not mutually exclusive, they do create a stereotypical image. Especially relevant is the word disorder. ADHD is an especially prevalent disorder in our society, and while it may be more accepted than other stigmatized disorders, it is still heavily stigmatized to the point where there are many misconceptions about what it is and what it is not.
The symptoms of ADHD noted in historical and contemporary discussions primarily revolve around the inability to maintain focus to a given subject. Combined with the commonly known symptom of being unable to sit still, people with ADHD are often thought of as continuously changing their focus from subject to subject, both physically and mentally. With society continually evolving to expect and require far more intense periods of focused attention through long school days for children with very structured classes and moving on to a career in a bland cubicle, it's no surprise that a person's inability to remain focused has become all the more noticeable and exaggerated than it would have been previously.
Another factor that convolutes the issue more is the fact that ADHD is often comorbid with a number of other psychiatric conditions and functional impairments which may become evident during clinical assessments, which may make ADHD seem more severe or complicated than it really is. But it does not detract from the thought that ADHD is a disorder that is lifelong and affects the success of many people.
Previously, we heard from Ari and Charlotte about the origin of the myth, the background information, and what the kernel of truth is within the myth. Now that we have learned about these topics, we can actively engage in the reasons that this myth is false and what we can do to dispel this particular myth.
In order to begin disassembling why the myth is false, we must first recognize and understand the cognitive processes of attention. As defined by Goldstein in the text, attention is the ability to focus on specific stimuli or locations. The attempt to focus on homework while ignoring the surrounding discussion, like in a lecture, is an example of selective attention, which is the process of attending to one stimulus while ignoring others. Distraction is when one stimulus interferes with the processing of another stimulus. Divided attention is paying attention to more than one thing at a time. Attentional capture is a rapid shifting of attention that is usually caused by a stimulus such as loud noise or bright light or sudden movements. Lastly, Visual scanning is the movement of the eyes from one location or object to another. Mechanically, through the lens of cognitive neuroscience, the frontal lobe is what determines action, control, and self-regulation. The primary motor responses, the Broca's area, which produces speech, assists the understanding of language, and anticipates signals. And in the prefrontal area of the brain are all responsible for the components of attention and focus. ADHD is associated with the way that certain neurotransmitters in the brain function. Differences in these functionalities may lead to changes in your attentional networks, but these neurodiversities do not inherently guarantee that you cannot focus your attention for extended periods, especially when managed efficiently. And the two are not synonymous, and this myth is too subjective and unclear of an association. Attention can be affected by many factors, and for example, mind wandering is extremely prevalent and, as shown in other studies, is distracting enough to disrupt an ongoing task. An example of disruption by mind wandering is what happens while reading when you suddenly realizing that you have no idea what you just read because you were thinking about something else. And this phenomenon, called mindless reading or zoned out reading, is one example of how that mind wandering can decrease performance. And these factors tend to be mistaken and are misconstructed with ADHD.
So why is the falsity of ADHD and attention in classrooms harmful to society, but more specifically to students?
So this ideology is harmful, ableist, and ignorant, also a product of misinformation. In addition, it encourages false cause and effect relationships, and an example of this is parents associating their young child's impatience or inability to sit still with symptoms of ADHD. Additionally, it's important to recognize that ADHD is not a disorder of the person, but of an unnatural society configuration. It's the environment, not the person. Another perspective that should be acknowledged is that the term deficit is harmful because positive interactions or associations with stimulus responses are actually the opposite of a deficit. In fact, ADHD-style brains have an activation surplus, but it may be addressed that it can be hard to assert your attention, especially when you're not interested. However, by understanding that surprise and novelty enable the spread of information, you can begin to methodize strategies dedicated to dispelling cognitive myths and pursuing factual information.
This is especially relevant given that 19 out of 32 people in a straw poll recently said that they believe people with ADHD cannot focus for extended focus periods of time. That's 60%. If that many people are ill-informed, there needs to be a way to correct this illusion. Imagine if you had ADHD and were working hard to do well and pay attention in your lectures, just to have your parents wholeheartedly believe this was impossible. This is quite close to that 60% figure, and definitely a majority believe in this myth. This experience would be incredibly disheartening for children to grow up hearing these myths, and to lack that kind of support could make it that much harder for students to overcome any struggles they might have with such stereotypes later in life.
Understanding the falsity and the harm that comes from believing myths and taking in the information we're given at face value, we now need to look at how to dispel these myths.
We can begin the process of dispelling the myth by having discussions and only talking about the true information. The article Fighting Fake News in the Classroom by Stephanie Pepas discusses how teachers can be a first step in teaching students to be critical thinkers and how to stop the spread of the myth in society. Starting in the classrooms allows us to teach our students to evaluate the information being told to them and investigate whether or not it is true. This allows students to take their own learning into their hands, and they can take this learning and pass it on to others. The 5 questions that Schwartz, Newman, and Leake created are incredibly important to take into consideration when trying to figure out how to analyze whether or not the information about ADHD is true. The questions are: do others believe it? Is there more supporting evidence? Do I believe it? Does it tell a good story? And does this come from a credible source? Looking at the myth, neurodiverse individuals with ADHD cannot focus their attention for extended periods of time. We need to analyze whether we believe this or not. Not only do we need to look at whether we believe it or not, we need to look at whether others believe the myth. Where's the supporting evidence that proves that the myth is correct? And it is our job to research and analyze whether this evidence comes from a credible source or if the source has a history of being biased. Some biases to keep an eye out for include confirmation bias, which is interpreting new evidence to fit into one's already existing beliefs. Groupthink bias occurs when we set aside our own thoughts and beliefs and take on the thoughts of the group.
It's important that these biases are recognized because these ideologies that are interpreting the misinformation are a product of cognitive biases. Thought biases like these persuade the continuation of these dangerous thought processes and become a cycle that leads to incorrect judgments, self-diagnosing, and the pursuit of unfit medical solutions, and so on. The dangerous component of thought biases is that what we think we see isn't always the truth. This leads to incorrect judgments of others. Additionally, by reinforcing misinformation with repetition, we further increase the spread and acceptance of misinformation.
It is also important to think and discuss logic. Logic is something that tends to be avoided due to emotion or personal thoughts or beliefs. Many refuse to acknowledge logic as being real because not many people want to be told what they think is false. It is important to be open and accepting of all logic and statistics when being presented with information. We have spent this episode discussing ADHD and breaking down the history, the kernel of truth, the falsity, and discussing how we can dispel the myth about people with ADHD not being able to pay attention. Next week, we will tackle another myth in the cognitive psychology realm.